Hey again, coming back, Nihilism, Anarchy, 21st century. Last video was introduction, so now we're actually going to get into it. We have a history of Russian nihilism. So this is definitely a little bit more lengthy of a chapter and lots of name dropping. So I'm probably going to end up butchering some of these because I am not fluent in Russian. So yeah. History of Russian nihilism. An understanding of Russian nihilism of the 1860s begins with an attempt to understand the concept of nihilism. This is naturally difficult because if there is a word that has an even more loaded and negative connotations than anarchism, it would be nihilism. This is particularly because the primary vehicle of our modern understanding of nihilism is through the fiction of Turgenev and Dostoevsky. Neither of these authors were particularly sympathetic to nihilism and provided nihilist characters primarily as a frame with which to drape their morality tales. The version of nihilism offered by these authors is then primarily a snapshot of the popular culture in which nihilism dwelt as much as it is a recollection of the trend. This time in Russian history is a part of the story of nihilism and will be part of the story in bridging the gap between the mythological Bazarov, Vershkovsky, or Raskolnikov and figures like Nicolai Chernyshevsky, Dmitry Pisarev, and to some extent, Sergey Neychayev. What then was nihilism? Nihilism was a youth movement, a philosophical tendency, and a revolutionary impulse. Nihilism was the valorization of natural sciences. Nihilism was a specific fashion style. Nihilism was a new approach to aesthetics, criticisms, and ethics. Nihilism was the contradiction between a studied materialism and the desire to annihilate the social order. Nihilism was also particularly Russian response to the conditions of the Tsarist reform and repression. Nihilism has become much more than it originally would have been capable of because of the viral nature of its value system practice and conclusions. Nihilism's effect is traceable through the history of anarchism, through the formation and modern practice of terrorism, and through philosophical trends from deconstruction to existentialism. Russia in the mid-19th century was a place of increasing tension. The revolution of 1848 that touched most of the European continent did not drastically affect Russia. As a result of the Russian campaign to subdue Napoleon from 1812 to 1815, Western ideas were brought to Russia. These ideas most clearly articulated themselves as a desire for a constitution defending values like human rights, a representative government, and democracy. When the Tsar, Alexander I, died in 1825, a regiment of soldiers refused to pay allegiance to the new crown, wanting instead the establishment of a Russian constitution. These Russianized Russians were particularly frustrated because the colony of Poland was awarded a constitution by the Tsar. The Decembrists, as they were called, were suppressed and remained a symbol of the possibility of social change throughout the century. Alexander's successor, his brother Nicholas I, was an autocrat. He ruled Russia from 1825 to 1855 with a combination of secret police, the third section, censorship, nationalism, and colonialism. After the failure of the Crimean War against the combined might of the Ottoman Empire, Britain, France, and Russia were in the dire situation of being forced to make major reforms or no longer be considered a player on the European continent. The timing of this military failure by Russia coincided with the death of Nicholas I. His son, Alexander II, assumed the throne from 1855 to 1881. His reign began with the negotiation of a peace deal with the major powers of Europe and a major domestic reform. Alexander II, in the 6th year of his reign, freed the peasants. This meant that, as a class, the peasants became transformed into a class of independent communal proprietors, which meant that they had rights far beyond any other peasantry in Europe. This reform was coupled with changes to the military, judiciary, and local self-governance. The spirit of change was not dampened by the comparison of the transformations not into the past, but to a mythological state. And this sets the stage for nihilism. The New People, as they were called, existed before the publishing of the book Fathers and Sons in 1862 by Turgenev, but found a hero in the character of Pisarev. It is worth noting that the role of literature in Russian culture. Prose rose to prominence in the 1840s as the rise in publications of literary journals, printed novels, and serial. This form affected Russian culture so dramatically that Alexander's emancipation of the peasants is attributed in part to his reaction to Ivan Turgenev's collection of sportsman sketches that depicted the life of the peasant. Literature was a respected form of social commentary that broached issues from the generation gap in Fathers and Sons to the psychology of men and women under great duress, Dostoevsky, and in daily life, Tolstoy. This style of literature became known as realism due to its unflinching portrayal of contemporary life. The realist novel portrayed the experience of what was happening in Russian culture in the 1860s. That was nihilism. Foundational nihilism. Russian nihilists can be dissected perhaps unnaturally into two periods. The foundational period from 1860 to 1869, where the countercultural aspects of nihilism scandalized Russia, where even the smallest of indiscretions resulted in nihilists being sent to Siberia or imprisoned for lengthy periods of time, and where the philosophy of nihilism was formed. The other period that would be the revolutionary period of nihilism from 1870 to 1881, where the pamphlet The Catechism of a Revolutionist inspired the movement in waiting into a movement with teeth, with dozens of actions against the Russian state. The revolutionary period ends, of course, with the assassination of the Tsar, Alexander II, on March 13, 1881, by a series of bombs and the consequential crushing of the nihilist movement. It is arguable that Mikhail Bakunin, 1814 to 1876, Reaction in Germany, published 1842, with his famous dictum, "Let us therefore trust the eternal spirit, which destroys and annihilates only because it is unfathomable and eternal source of all life. The passion for destruction is a creative passion too." Both anticipated and instigated the ideas of nihilism. Bakunin was considered in Russia a westernizer because of his influences in the thinkers of the day from the continent proper. In Reaction, Bakunin's engaged with the Hegelian view by asserting that the negative and not the positive is the creative driving force of dialectics. While he is inexorably linked to both foundational and revolutionary periods of nihilism, Bakunin was a product of the earlier generation whose vision, ultimately, was not the same as the nihilist view. He stated this as best as, "I am a free man only as far as I recognize the humanity and the liberty of all men around me. In respecting their humanity, I respect my own." This general humanitarian instinct is in contrast to the nihilist proclamations of having a hate with a great and holy hatred, or for calling the annihilation of aesthetics, such as Pisarev. Nihilism was never a singular or even particularly disciplined body of thought. This is attributed to the reality that A, the main nihilist philosophers Chernyshevsky and Pisarev never held academic positions, B, that publishing was heavily censored under the Tsar, or, as is most likely, C, the nature of nihilism itself. Nihilism never had enough momentum, enough time, or the right conditions to become a mature philosophy. This resulted in it being an approximation to a body of ideas rather than a body of ideas. While strong positions were taken along several theoretical lines, none of which were developed in the generational method necessary for these ideas to hold historical purchase. While natural science was seen as the most potential intellectual tool, more nihilist commentary was made in the field of aesthetics, this being related to the obscurity principle. The obscurity principle says that in times of repression and the most cognate social commentary happens in the vehicle of fiction, where your intention is obscured because you appear to be talking about something entirely different than you are. In the case of nihilists, ours was anathema because it aggravated sentimentalism, emotionalism, irrationalism, spiritualism, and was a waste of resources. This obscured the fact that nihilists were actually talking about the values of the current order embedded in the vehicle of art, but this connection couldn't be made more clearly in the context of censorship. Oh, my phone is dying, so I'm going to wrap up around revolutionary nihilism, which will be a few more minutes. So, as a positive philosophy, nihilism took positions within the framework of established philosophy. Nihilist materialism boiled down to the view that only what is perceptible exists. Man, then, was a complex chemical compound governed strictly by the law of causality. Ethics, as argued by Chernyshevsky and Pisarev, can be described as the scientific jurisdiction for hedonism. The nihilistic position on epistemology was realist and contrary to the phenomenalism of the time. Art was valuable in a direct relationship to its social usefulness. However, that is defined, which it was not. As these positions reflect, nihilism was not at the strongest as a positive philosophy, and due to the transformation of nihilism from a position to an action, there was never a particularly focused development for these ideas. As a matter of course, nihilism became more coherent position only in banned texts smuggled into Russia from emigres. The most prolific of these emigres was Alexander Herzen from 1812 to 1870, who established the Free Russian Press in London, where he published until his death. The press was well known for its publications of radical literature that ranged from To the Younger Generation, 1861, that argued for the replacement of the Tsar by an employee of the state, to the journals The Polar Star and Voices of Russia. His most well-known journal was The Bell, which was smuggled into Russia, where it was quite popular through the foundational nihilist period by those who desired social reform. In hindsight, his views were rather conservative, especially in light of what nihilism would become from The Bell in 1865. Social progress is possible only under complete republican freedom, under full democratic equality. It is as a political position that nihilism attracted attention and was transformed from a discussion between learned men into a social movement. Nihilist politics began as a branch of the socialist tree. They were most influenced by the French socialism of the time, from Charles Fourier, 1872 to 1837, Ludwig Feuerbach from 1804 to 1872, Auguste Comte from 1898 to 1857, and John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. Obscure German materialists, Buchner, Moleschott, and Vogt. The nihilist contribution to socialism in general was the concept that the peasant was an agent of social change. Chernyshevsky, a criticism of philosophical prejudices against the Obstina, 1858, and not just the bourgeois reformers of the revolutions of 1848 or the proletariat of the Marx, a concept that wouldn't reach Russia until later. Agitation for this position landed Chernyshevsky in prison and exile in Siberia for the next 25 years, although the specific accusations which he was convicted were a concoction. The first group, inspired by nihilist ideas to form and work towards social change, did so as a secret society and were called Land and Freedom. This group's name was also taken by another entirely separate group during the revolutionary nihilist period. The first, Land and Freedom, conspired to support the Polish independence movement and to agitate the peasants who were burdened with debt as the result of the crippling redemption payments required by the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. Polish independence was not of particularly interest to the nihilists, and after a plot to incite Kazan peasants to revolt failed, Land and Freedom folded in 1863. Thus begins the first period of nihilist secret societies. The organization created a boys' school in Moscow slum in order to train revolutionaries in terrorism. In addition, they had a secret subgroup called Hell, whose purpose was political terrorism, with the assassination of the Tsar as the ultimate goal. This resulted in the failed attempt by Dmitry Karakozov on the 4th of April, 1866. Dmitry fired a revolver but had his arm jostled by an artisan who died before the potential assassin of the excess drink as a result of his change of social status. Dmitry was tried and hanged at Smolensky Field in St. Petersburg. The leader of the organization, Nicolai Ishutin, was also tried and was to be executed before being exiled to Serbia for life. Thus ended the organization and began the White Terror for the rest of the 1860s. The White Terror began by the Tsar putting Count Michael Morogov, due to his treatment of Polish rebels in prior years, in charge of suppression of the Nihilists. The two leading radical journals, The Contemporary and Russian Word, were banned. Liberal reforms were minimized by reactionary afterthoughts, and the educational system was reformed to strike the revolutionary spirit that lived there. This action by the Russian state marks the end of the foundational period for nihilism. The lifestyle of the nihilists or new people is worth reviewing, if for no other reason because of its similarity to youth movements of the modern era. While advocating for a callous hedonism and radical subjectivity, in practice, nihilists actually tended towards a utilitarian and ascetic lifestyle. The fashion is a case in point. Both sexes favored blue-tinted spectacles and high boots. Other common features were a heavy walking stick and a rug flung over the shoulders in cold weather. They called it plaid, but it wasn't necessarily a tartan. This coupled with huge beard for men and bobs for women, a voracious appetite for cigarettes, an unwashed, dirty appearance, and rude and outspoken behavior made the new people a sight to behold. The nihilists attempted to challenge the values of the day in a more meaningful way, too. At the time, the question of a woman's emancipation was of great interest to reformers. For the nihilists, the issues were regarding work and sexual freedom. Because a woman's passport, which was used for general travel and not just travel abroad, was legally controlled by men, a father or husband had ultimate control over a woman's life. The nihilists solved this problem by having fictitious marriages, and this allowed for an emancipation of women de jure, if not de facto. This resulted in women having the freedom of mobility to pursue some academic pursuits, which were curtailed during the White Terror, and some enterprise. Finally, the nihilists adopted the credo that adultery was a natural and even desirable trait, in contrast to the spirit of their time or their own cultural composition, i.e., they were prudes. More influential of the new people than philosophy or political texts was literature. This expression of the tension between generations by Bakunin in Father and Sons as the rejection of the romantic and idealistic postures guaranteed his position as an icon of the nihilist movement. This was even through Turngenev's intention to portray the new people as in a less than flattering light. The publication of Chernyshevsky's What is to be Done, 1863, which was written in prison, became the guiding light to the movement within its pages, was a vision of the socialist values of the nihilists, an exposition of how to live with radical views intact, how to practice nihilist non-monogamy. The power of literature on the movement is ironic because, of course, most of our modern understanding of the nihilist movement comes from the novels of Turgenev and Dostoevsky. While Turgenev was non-judgmental in his depiction of the new people and respected by the nihilists, Chernyshevsky, having held correspondence with him, Dostoevsky was in violent reaction to them. While Dostoevsky was involved in radical activity against the Tsar in the 1840s, during his exile in Siberia, he became an Orthodox Christian. Upon his return, he became quite upset at nihilism in general, and Chernyshevsky specifically. The last 5 novels of Dostoevsky dealt with nihilism to some degree, either centrally or as a major theme. So yeah, that wraps up foundational nihilism. And next time I have a better charge of my phone, I will go ahead with the revolutionary nihilism. This is still the history of Russian nihilism. But yeah, thanks for watching.